Where the bloody hell is it, Jenkins? I want my big book of Me163 victories. No, I've looked under K for kills. What? Oh God, yes, good point. Now, where are we? Yes, the smallest books shelf. The enormous book of Italian war heroes. No, that's small, certainly, but also very racist, and it smells slightly of pear drops for some reason. Genghis Khan's Guide on Surrendering Cities. It just says, kill them all. Brilliant decisions made by Hitler. No, not that one. No, that's the quality control checklist for the 1942 T-34. Here we are. Weird. It seems to be almost blank. What? They're here? Oh, blast! Hang on, let me at least put my jacket on. Well, hello, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, pretender to the throne of Upper Cronenberg and campaigner for the immediate enslavement of all helicopter pilots for crimes against aviation and God. You are watching a video on the Me163, the world's first rocket fighter, and all-round massive black hole of Nazi resources in the Second World War. I assume you clicked on this because you enjoy aviation, which is great, but if you're after a feeds and speeds type video, this may not be for you. I will give you all the technical detail that you could possibly wish for, but my objective here is not so much to describe the key characteristics as to walk through the factors around the aircraft. We'll look at what came before it, some of the minds behind it, their thinking, the politics, the production of the aircraft itself, and then of course how it performed. In short, there is probably a bit more here than just how fast it went. In fact, we can simply dispose of that question up front and say that it was the fastest aircraft on Earth before Chuck Yeager's X-1, regularly tickling the sound barrier in level flight. It exceeded 1,000 kilometers an hour, almost the first time it went up. It used an innovative design not seen anywhere else before or since, but there was a good reason for that. It was also a colossal waste of resources that languished in an interminable pit of politics and despair, and it did sweet all to stop the Allies. It should have been scrapped long before it was, and I think that story is at least as interesting. A second warning pertaining to the first. I do not like Nazis, and I will swear, and I will attempt humour from time to time. For reasons that surpass my understanding, this makes some people apoplectically cross, in which case this video is not for you. In the words of Cromwell, in the name of God, go. Lastly, you should know that every man has his price, and in my case, the roof on the East Wing is currently doing its level best to impersonate a tributary of the Zambezi River, neatly directing water not into the guttering, but instead over several minor Renaissance masterpieces. Since Jenkins is unwilling to climb onto the roof and reseal it, and apparently using child labour for the task is against the law, or some such bloody rubbish, this isn't the Brexit I bloody voted for, I am forced to ask you to consider clicking on the like button, or making a comment, or even subscribing. Or if you are really keen, then joining my Patreon, depending on how much you like me. If you do not, then I may be forced to evict this small family from their small holding to pay for the repairs. You have been warned. Without further ado then, let us away to the Me163. If one was to have a conversation with an alien just landed from outer space, here to explore the human condition and explain to them the course of the rise of the Nazi state, the Second World War, and things like the Me262, the V2, or the Tiger tank, it is quite possible that your new alien friend might pause from warming up that, probe and postulate thus. And I suppose they built a rocket-powered fighter which could get to 39,000 feet, have 4 minutes of endurance, ineffectual armament, and use fuel which dissolved human flesh. And really all you could do at that point is nod, partly of course due to the restraining bolts, but also because it is a storyline which is almost wholly predictable given the Nazis' proclivity towards useless excess and machismo. Thus we will turn today to the Me163 Muppet. Komet. As with so many things in the Nazi war machine, the origins of the Comet go back into the 1920s, when Germany was a democratic republic and restricted in what it was and wasn't allowed to do under the Versailles Treaty. Even as Hitler was busy shouting at beer halls filled with drunken former soldiers and anti-Semites, and despite the economy collapsing faster than a vegan in an abattoir, military research continued apace, albeit quietly. Specifically research into things not covered by the Versailles Treaty, which meant, at least for flying, mostly gliders and rockets. Inevitably, this drew a fair share of cranks and crazies, one of them being Alexander Lippisch. Aside from looking like Surface Agent X-20 from Stingray, Lippisch was interested in gliders, and in 1927 he started to work with the wonderfully named DFS. It was not, as I first thought, a business which provides cut-price three-piece suites every bank holiday, but instead the German Institute for Gliding, Deutsche Forschungsinstitut für Segelflug. Lippisch was an outstanding thinker, not necessarily for the right reasons. Over the next 20 years he would demonstrate not just an astounding aptitude for design, but also a startling inability to work with anyone, falling out with them and then resigning from basically every post he'd ever held. In between slagging matches with his paymasters, Lippisch's particular obsession became designing tailless aircraft. aircraft. Everyone else had basically agreed on the template for making planes controllable and flyable, but oh no, not Alexander. This perhaps shouldn't be a galloping shock. He decided to go in a totally different direction, and that everyone else was wrong, and only he and a handful of others, like the Horton brothers, were right, building planes that really lacked any kind of control surfaces where you'd expect them to be, and perhaps indeed needed them. I mentioned rockets before, so we should probably be mindful that as Alexander was trying to design things with no engines whatsoever, a bunch of bright young things in the VFR, that's the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, or Spaceship Association in English, were trying to make engines that made a lot of boom. I've mentioned them before in my video on Rocket Rolf, so you can find out more there if you want to. Suffice to say that these guys used a bit of scrubland just outside of Berlin to blow up a lot of stuff in new and interesting ways, and publishing their results in their own journal, Die Rakete, which had a surprisingly large readership following a number of high-profile German films about rockets, most notably the wonderful 1927 film Frau in Mond. I've linked once again to it in the description. You really should watch it, it's brilliant. To highlight their work, a series of high-profile prototypes were produced, either using solid fuel or powdered rockets. Cars and trains and planes all had rockets strapped to them, and the touch paper was lit, and a few hair-raising minutes later, they would either have crashed or set new speed records. Surprisingly few of them died, but once the rockets were lit, there was no choice but to just cling on for dear life. They couldn't be stopped. It is also perhaps unsurprising that from about 1930, the VFR started to receive direct funding from the German Army Ordnance Board. And as the 1930s progressed, the newly unveiled Luftwaffe became interested in what my American cousins would call JOTO, and what we call over here RATOG, or Rocket-Assisted Takeoff Gear. In double quick time, these writings came to the attention of a chap called Helmuth Walter, and he decided to try and apply what he'd read to torpedoes and possibly also to submarines. After all, if you can make an engine run without oxygen for spaceflight, then you might be able to apply these same ideas to the more practical and terrestrial, but equally difficult environment of the sea. What's that, Jenkins? You want to know how rocket engines work? Okay, fine, bit of a tangent, but I'll explain, I guess. If you ever find yourself in urgent need of making a liquid-fueled rocket, my firm advice is very simple. Don't. Do something less dangerous, like, I don't know, mine detecting with a hammer or bobbing for hand grenades. But there are situations in which you don't have a great deal of choice. Basically, any environment in which you don't have oxygen you can easily put into an engine and you want to be able to throttle it in some way, then I'm afraid liquid fuels are the only answer. Almost the first consideration you need to have in mind then is the fuel itself. The fuel needs, how can I put this, it needs to explode. Ideally only when you want it to explode, but in this field beggars really can't be choosers, and one's primary consideration needs to be that it'll go bang. You can worry about under what conditions it'll go bang later. Not unreasonably, most people who were thinking these thoughts at the dawn of the rocket age looked at gunpowder as a place to start, and then they rapidly realised that for flights of any distance you needed something which could store far more energy at a much lower weight. Also, once you'd started to set fire to gunpowder, and indeed to all solid and powdered fuels, you're committed. Just as one cannot be a bit pregnant, one cannot be a little bit on fire with these fuels. If you want to make any kind of throttle or control available for, say, I don't know, manoeuvring or staging, or simply because, oh my god, make it stop, then liquid fuels are where it is at, a realization which hit rocket scientists pretty quickly, figuratively and sometimes literally, in the late 1920s. The smart move here, at least in 1929, was using a combination of liquid hydrogen as your fuel and liquid oxygen as your oxygen source, your oxidizer. Burn them and you get flames and water. Happy days. The problem was making liquid hydrogen in the late 1920s in Germany was a complete non-starter. It was just too hard, and both hydrogen and oxygen in liquid form needed to be kept unbelievably cold, which limited their practical use. What was needed was a fuel that could cope with being a liquid at a reasonable temperature, say from, I don't know, plus 30 Celsius to minus 20 Celsius, and have a decent calorific value, which meant that you didn't need to carry tons of the stuff, and ideally it needed to be fairly easy to get hold of. This was not as simple a task as one might think, which often led to using fuels that had some, let's call them aggressive tendencies, like being highly carcinogenic or corrosive or volatile or all three. In 1921, the American physicist Robert Goddard did what came naturally to all Americans and used gasoline as a fuel, burning it with liquid oxygen as his oxidizer. And this burnt incredibly hot, far hotter than his rockets would really cope with, but nonetheless, he didn't die. Sadly, he also didn't tell anybody else what he was doing for ages, so no one knew. From here, quite frankly, things got more than just a little bit out of hand, and through the 1930s, folks were experimenting with all manner of exotic-sounding stuff. Sulfuric acid, red fuming nitric acid, whatever the hell that is, it sounds absolutely bloody awful to me, and various flavours of hydrazine. But what if you could get two substances that, when they came in contact with one another, would just spontaneously ignite? That'd be pretty rad. Well, actually it'd be unspeakably dangerous, but you would generate the necessary boom pretty fast. Thus various scientists, often with missing digits, eyebrows and indeed eyes, began to play with these so-called hypergolic fuels, that is, fuels which are going to go bang when they touch one another. Typically, bipropellant burns a lot less hot, making the vessel which needs to contain them less difficult to make. But that lower temperature is normally a result of getting slightly less bang for the volume of liquids involved, and also has the side effect of opening up the potential for what is euphemistically referred to as a hard start. That is where the oxidizer and the fuel mix but don't immediately explode, building up and then suddenly going bang, normally with catastrophic results. Pretty rapidly, bright sparks in the Soviet Union, Britain, Italy, and the US and Germany all came up with the concept of a monopropellant. Now this is a fucking genius idea. Why take two bottles into the rocket, when you can take one? Get the right monopropellant and you can start having fuel and oxygen all in one liquid. One explosive liquid. The drawback here being that you now have a tube filled with high explosive liquid that will, basically without much provocation, explode. Or, in layman's terms, congratulations, you've built a bomb with a nozzle on the end of it. If you can then, it is wise to find one that doesn't go bang without something happening to it. Typically that's normally either heating it or adding some kind of catalyst to the environment. As I mentioned a minute ago, Helmuth Walter had exactly the same idea, thinking about torpedoes or potentially rocket-powered underwater U-boats, but this time with a monopropellant. Hard to see how that could possibly go wrong in a contained vessel underwater with oxygen all around at pressure. Anyway, the idea was fairly simple, what amounted to getting a massively concentrated blonde hair dye in the form of hydrogen peroxide at about 80%, adding a catalyst and it would burn, possibly even underwater. Now the Kriegsmarine, not being entirely insane, looked at their tiny number of boats and then at the incredibly toxic and explosive devices that Walther was proposing to put in them, and quite understandably said that they were busy washing their uniforms that night and backed gently out of the room. Walther too realised that maybe this wasn't quite so smart, so he began to experiment with potentially hypergolic mixtures until he came across what he thought was this sort of Goldilocks zone that was really hydrazine and hydrogen peroxide, the two combusting nicely on demand. And in 1935 he managed to create a prototype engine using what he referred to as C-Stoff, which was a mixture of hydrazine and methanol, and T-Stoff, which was his beloved hydrogen peroxide. The challenges here that will become truly evident into the Me163's fuel system is not just that would these fuels explode on contact with one another, they would explode on contact with all kinds of things. Hydrogen peroxide at that level of concentration would set fire to virtually everything. Rubber hoses, gaskets, copper, lead, overalls, skin, all would lead to spontaneous combustion. C-Stoff, the methanol-hydrazine mixture, was also highly corrosive, requiring specialist fuel lines, and it reacted with things like, for example, aluminium in very unpredictable ways, meaning it needed a completely different fueling system made of steel, adding weight and complexity. We'll discuss the engine in a bit, but these are worth bearing in mind. By now it was 1937 and there was one group of mad lads in Germany's emerging military program who wanted as much boom as Walther could provide, envisioning a rocket boost for aircraft on takeoff, and they of course were the Luftwaffe. All they needed was some kind of glider to strap it to, and discussion of gliders requires us briefly to look at how wings work. Sometimes I look at the diagram of a wing and I nod sagely at it and force myself to pretend that I believe all the things that engineers say about how lift works. But somehow in the back of my mind I can't quite shift the idea that really planes are held aloft by lots of little tiny air demons. However, for all my skepticism about whether or not aircraft are borne aloft by invisible spirits, one thing I definitely do believe in is engines. In my opinion, aircraft should have them. Being able to open the taps and get oneself out of the shit is an important attribute in any aeroplane. Unfortunately, there are certain groups of deranged people who think that aeroplanes without engines are jolly good fun. Do not speak to these people because they are only fractionally saner than helicopter pilots. If you haven't been in a glider, then the procedure follows roughly thus. Some nutter, often with a maniacal grin and a big moustache, will sit behind you and tell you that this engineless freak will fly and to just do as they say. At some point, if you are stupid enough to show any aptitude, they will mutter something about showing you what this baby can do. If you have a parachute, this is the time to get out. If you do not, then they will probably point the stupid, flappy, long-winged, engineless wonder at the ground, at which point you will instinctively want to grab the stick and pull back on it as hard as you can. This will be a huge mistake, it will definitely kill you. Basically, the wings will stall, the sky demons will not be able to hold it up with their little hands anymore, and instead you will plummet towards the ground. What you have to do is to gently, oh so gently, pull back on the stick and give the Sky Demons time and speed to lift you up. The nutter in the back seat will probably be making whooping noises at about this point. I have done this a few times and I have so far not died, but I consider it nothing short of a miracle. Engineers will tell you this is because gliders are perfectly safe, but I prefer to believe it's because I do a ritual where I burn a small quantity of helicopter pilot's hair on the nose before takeoff, thus appeasing the Sky Demon spirits. In Germany in 1924, the first national gliding club was established, the Rhone-Reise Gesellschaft, or RRG, in Wasserkup, with the aim of standardizing glider designs and creating a national championship. And a few years later, Alexander Lippisch joined the society as head of their design office, and that sounds frightfully grand, but in reality, this consisted of a group of enthusiastic friends in a shed trying to work out how to make this gliding malarkey work better. The problem was, as I mentioned before, Alexander's primary interest wasn't so much in the gliding bit as being a contrary bastard and building an airframe with no tail. In theory, an aircraft that is formed solely out of a wing should be highly efficient, with low drag, meaning that the aircraft can be made lighter, a predictable centre of gravity, which should, at least on paper, make it faster and more fuel efficient. The downside is that you tend to have less control over slippage, a bit like a boat going through the water without a keel down. Over the next few years, Lippisch experimented with various tailless designs, which varied from the pretty conventional to the pretty bizarre. He toyed with the idea of using winglets on things like this is the RRG Delta, and then the powered version of it, the Delta 4. Even as Walter was busy in the background blowing things up, Lippisch was feeling his way towards doing a tailless design, which kind of actually did have a tail. Moreover, he did some experiments for the RRG on rocket-assisted takeoffs for gliders in the 1920s, which caught the attention of the press. In 1933, as soon as Hitler came to power, Lippisch joined the Nazi Party and through that met Ernst Udet, who, although not completely sold on the idea of flying wings, was interested in the potential for using gliders for his nascent Luftwaffe. By 1937, Lippisch had refined his Delta 4 into the DFS 194, which, well, look at it. I mean, basically, this is an Me163A. See, I told you we'd get there. According to Lippisch, so you should take this with a pinch of salt because he is a lying bastard in everything he wrote. At an airshow one day, he was approached by a guy called Dr. Lorenz, who I frankly can't find a picture of, so suck it up. He's only going to be around for a hot second. Anyway, Lorenz said to Lippisch, "Which of your aircraft would be best suited to a special power plant?" Trying to be, subtle-like on account of him being in a public airshow and stuff. "Oh," says your man, "you mean a rocket engine?" At which point, Dr. Lorenz nearly fainted. The whole Walther rocket program was supposed to be a state secret. In fact, it was. It's just that Lippisch was being a prick and taking a bit of a guess, which he proved to be right. Anyway, Alexander wasn't hauled in by the Gestapo, but rather asked to alter his DFS 194 for a rocket engine that he didn't know the size of, nor know the weight of, nor know the thrust of, which was a bit of a problem. This left him doing a series of glide tests with the 194, which proved to be remarkably good at aerobatics and staying aloft, and the combination of an apparently excellent design plus rockets got Udet's complete attention in 1938. I've talked about the relationship between Udet, Milch and Messerschmitt before, and if you want the skinny in detail, go watch some of my previous videos, but suffice to say that Milch hated Messerschmitt with a passion, and he was dedicated to making Udet look like a fool. Udet, meanwhile, had a serious drink, drug and woman habit, as well as a massive handicap of being a rather nice bloke with no technical training in charge of the technical department of the Luftwaffe. Oh, and having Hermann Göring for a boss who was instinctively a bully and literally ran concentration camps if you fucked things up. This is what I like to think of as the ultimate hostile work environment. Lippisch, by this point, had upset literally everybody, firstly at the DFS, and then at the RRG, and then at the DVL, and had no chance whatsoever of being able to get his own design bureau off the ground. Nonetheless, Udet was interested enough to try and take the project seriously. Therefore, he turned to his right-hand man, Milch, and asked what Milch thought. And Milch said, "What about making that smug motherfucker Willy Messerschmitt pay for the project?" "Excellent," said Udet. "Let's do that." And so it was, in January of 1939, much against Willy Messerschmitt's wishes, a new department, modestly titled Department L for Lippisch, was established at the Messerschmitt headquarters in Augsburg. Instead of using Messerschmitt's staff, as might have been politic, Department L was instead staffed exclusively by Lippisch's hand-picked team. This would have been enough to piss most people off as it was, but this new department was classified top secret and had direct patronage from the very top of the Luftwaffe. It could use Messerschmitt's offices, name, credit line, production facilities, engineering staff, supplier base, hangar space, bank accounts, and everything else without answering to anybody within the Messerschmitt staff itself. If Alexander found a good designer, he simply seconded him to his department. He took over the Messerschmitt lecture hall with, quote, very good views on the works and the airfield, and began to issue instructions to all parts of the Messerschmitt business, all of which led to what Lippisch later described as an unfortunate, short-sighted hostility to me and my team. Jesus, Alex, I wonder why. Meanwhile, Walther and his wonderfully named Waltherwerk had not been idle. Firstly, they produced the R2203 engine, a monopropellant engine using T-Stoff, which became known as the cold engine. And the challenges with T-Stoff began to become clear. Not just would it explode if it was heated slightly, but it would be constantly decomposing, meaning that it was creating its own heat. And as it got hotter, this reaction would speed up, so that it would go at first very slowly and then very, very fast indeed. Walther added stabilizers to his mixture, but nonetheless this process was constantly happening all day and all night until it got used or it went boom. Storing it in vessels that were in any way contaminated by dirt would cause either instant explosions or explosions at a later date. Ground crew took to pressing their ears up against the storage tanks to try and judge just how much fizzing was going on inside and whether or not they had a problem on their hands. It's worth pointing out that Walther's key innovation with the R2 was to provide a sort of throttle to the engine, basically allowing a pilot to select different power levels. This was a step up from every other rocket motor up to this point, and by early 1939, the first Walther rocket engines were ready for production. But in 1940, the RAF happened to the Luftwaffe, and suddenly Göring was shitting himself about aircraft production figures. He ordered a complete halt to all work that didn't bear fruit in the next 12 months. However, Göring's diktat hit reality pretty quickly. Udet was supremely bribable, Willy Messerschmitt was hell-bent on trying to get his Me209 program off the ground, and Lippisch was a bloody-minded arse who was going to try and make his plane come hell or high water. But nonetheless, it significantly slowed down the program as materials, production of fuels, engineers and manufacturing time were channeled into more mainstream ideas. All of this meant that the first flight of the Me163A with the R2 engine didn't actually happen until the 1st of September 1941. And it flew very, very well indeed, immediately smashing records in level flight and proving itself to be a nifty little flyer. But as cool as all of this was, range and fuel efficiency were a problem, and on top of that, the Me163A was really just a kind of modified DFS-194, meaning there was no room for guns, or armour, or radio equipment, and it had a very limited ceiling and lots of odds and sods which really needed to be fixing before it could be made at scale. The Luftwaffe was suddenly interested again and ordered work to begin in December of 1941 for an armed version, which would become known as the Me163B. It's really just worth saying, a quick aside here, it's not totally clear when the 163 began to become known as the Komet. We will occasionally refer to it as the Komet, but I don't think that name actually emerged until 1943, but there we go. This sounded great, but there were real compromises to make it fit into what was still a very modestly sized airframe, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The real challenge would be the new engines though, so let's talk about the delights of the HWK 109-509 hot engine. The basic principle of rocket engines is moving gas at high speed from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. This is normally assisted, at least in the 1940s, by burning the fuel to create heat and thus additional thrust. The HWK 109-509, which we'll simply call the 509 from here on out just to make things a little bit easier, used the R2 as the basis of the engine design. That is, it was running T-Stoff over a permanganate catalyst in order to achieve ignition, but then it added C-Stoff, which would react with the exhaust and burn hot. So this weirdly became known as the hot engine. In theory, there were a number of advantages to this approach. You got a lot more bang for your buck, it should be much more fuel efficient, and it reduced reliance on the hard-to-get T-Stoff. Win all round, right? Well, kind of. All of that was true, but suddenly Walther was looking at making a massively more complicated engine, effectively bolting two together, and he still had to squeeze it into the dinky little airframe of the 163. Also, no one had quite realised just how hard the material science part of this was going to be. For example, it needed to be carefully timed to avoid a hard start, and it also had to try and keep pressures the same across the different fuel tanks. The added complexity also meant that the forced labourers that Walther and everyone else was using to build engines was completely ill-suited to this type of work. Mistakes could, and did, lead to catastrophic failures. The 509 was incredibly hard to get right, and so it wasn't until May 1943 that a pre-production set of engines entered manufacturing. These units, designated as A0, proved to be highly dangerous and difficult to operate. The A1 production model didn't come on stream until August 1944, by which point it was almost too late, and consequently many Me163Bs went into action with prototype engines and paid the price. The RLM were pushed to such extremes that they began to examine alternative engines, most notably one from BMW, and try and force that somehow into the 163B, but it actually proved to be even more unreliable and dangerous to operate, detonating on test stands with monotonous regularity. A particular problem was the throttleable action. On the R2, it had been fairly simple to throttle the engine using a valve system, which just opened and closed the catalyst aperture. But on the 509, things got much more complicated. A turbo pump was fitted to try and deal with both the lack of the pressure in the system and to create a sort of gearing, a bit like a bike's gears, to give it a bit more control. Now, this did help, but if the timing got thrown off or if the fuel pooled, then there was a serious risk of a catastrophic explosion. So the idea was basically to keep the fuel moving when idling. This meant that at cruise, the setting actually didn't improve the range, it just threw more unburnt fuel out of the back of the unit. And at the end, this just kind of proved an insurmountable problem in the timescale, so the 509 went into production despite having this as a known fault. Bear this in mind as we talk about the aircraft itself. Effectively, most of its production run in its early operational life, Valther was struggling to get the engine to work and then into production at breakneck speed, using forced labour and, of course, operating in complete secrecy. What was more, the design contained many known flaws that weren't passed on to the fabrication plants, nor indeed to the operating crews, and certainly not to the Luftwaffe High Command, who were mostly kept in the dark about all the engineering issues. And this was a recipe for complete disaster and cock-up, and it would kill a large number of Luftwaffe flyers and ground crew. Now, one might reasonably assume that the engineering issues would have been the primary problem slowing the Me163 down, but this is Nazi Germany, so of course it wasn't. So let's talk about the production of the aircraft itself. Production of both the unarmed Me163A and then the 163B fighter version was, to say the very fucking least, a nightmare. Initially, of course, the Messerschmitt 163 was to be made by, well, logically enough, Messerschmitt at Augsburg. But, see, there were problems. Big problems. We discussed Udet before. He had been the primary backer of the 163, but in November of 1941 he shot himself. When Ernst died, his right-hand man, Erhard Milch, took over. And so it was, from December of 1941, that Erhard Milch found himself in charge of the technical directorate of the RLM, with control over basically all of Willy Messerschmitt's projects, including the 163. As I've discussed in other videos, Milch basically wanted Willy Messerschmitt to suffer and devoted an ungodly amount of his energies and efforts to that end, rather than, trying to do his job properly. The 163, of course, was still not a viable aeroplane yet, but because it pissed off Willy Messerschmitt to have Department L in place, Milch was more than happy to leave things as they were. Lippisch was not, and at about this point Lippisch made a very ill-advised attempt to try and take over the whole of Messerschmitt. After 12 months of internecine struggle, Willy had won his fight with Milch, and Milch had managed to lose Hitler's patronage. In doing so, he fatally exposed Lippisch. See how all of this fits together? In the end, Lippisch's head was the price that Willy named for continuing with the 163 project, something that Milch urgently needed to do to avoid humiliation, potentially even a fatal accident. So Lippisch was forced to write a resignation letter that included the line, "My differences with Herr Messerschmitt are at an end, and my project has got everything that it needed," neither of which was remotely true. On the 26th of March 1943, Lippisch left his post at Messerschmitt, Department L was shut down, and this basically ended Lippisch's involvement with the 163. He went off to go and design the P-13, a completely insane design, which was basically a jet-powered fighter with no guns, designed not to shoot bombers down so much as to ram them. But that, as we say, is another story. With both of its primary supporters gone and no engine, things weren't looking great for the 163 program, and they rapidly got worse. Messerschmitt considered it mission accomplished with Alex gone and back on the board, and so he promptly withdrew all of his remaining support, started soft-pedalling on commitments to the RLM and moving staff over to the 262 project in the hope that the project would get killed and Milch might get killed too. Even so, Milch wasn't prepared to just let the 163 wither on the vine, and he did manage to get the RLM to take the program over directly. Production responsibilities were then taken away from Messerschmitt and instead given to that titan of German industry that we all know today, Heinkel. Oh, wait, no, hang on. Mercedes? No. BMW? No. Wait, here we go. Oh, God. Hahn-Klemm Flugzeugbau. What do you mean you've never heard of them before? See, there might be a reason for that. Klemm made wooden aircraft, with propellers and shit. They did not make metal ones with rocket engines. In a move only a civil servant could think was a good idea, the RLM was effectively trying to jump horses mid-race, only they were kind of jumping from a feisty thoroughbred to a clapped-out pony. Clem was a fraction of the size of Messerschmitt and wholly unequal to the task. Faced with what he thought would be a complete disaster, Clem's founding director Hans Clem promptly resigned. Undeterred by such trifling matters as this, Milch managed to find a keen idiot from the RLM and just sort of dropped them in charge of Clem. So now you had a new manager whose knowledge of his business was exactly nil, who had no support from his pretty pissed off staff, and who was trying to get a wholly novel aircraft into the air that nobody knew anything about and put it into mass production. And the engine still wasn't ready. Excellent work, lads. Over 1943, the 1,200 Clem workers, many of whom were forced labour, were retrained in metalwork and given new jigs and told to get on with it. Somehow, by October of 1943, production was pretty much as ready to go as it was ever going to get. Except... Most people who are watching this who know a little bit about World War II will be aware of the famous Schweinfurt raid of October 1943 by the US AAF. If you're unfamiliar, I have covered it before, but the important bit in our story today is that despite the heavy losses of the first wave, which was aimed at the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, it did hit its target, and that in turn caused mad panic in the RLM, who immediately ordered that all aircraft production be dispersed across southern Germany in the Black Forest area, and this included 163 production at Clem. The most cogent account of what happened next that I could find is by a guy called Max Rubens, who was chief engineer in one of the subcontractors in Nagold just south of Stuttgart in 1944. In his testimony, taken after the war, he mentioned sites, and forgive me here, I'm going to butcher some German town names, Eberhausen, Nagold, Böblingen, Lahr, Ochenbach, Leipzig, Detz, Eib, Bullenroller, Probzella, Therme, Freiburg, Dessau, and Hechenberg, all supposed to be providing subcomponents or assemblies which were then sent by train to Brandenbrest for final assembly before the complete aircraft were then sent up to Hindenburg for acceptance testing, before then being disassembled, put back on trains and sent out to frontline units. On the one hand, this made it virtually impossible for the USAAF or the RAF to bomb all of these sites, but on the other hand, it made it virtually impossible for the RLM to orchestrate production. Post-war estimates suggest that this added at least 20% more to all production time and about 30 to 40% more cost on top. Max Rubens talks about regular overnight drives to try and get to the factories, and meeting every 2 weeks in Dessau, which required him to drive more than 1,000 kilometres to attend. The actual work was mostly done by forced labourers offered better rations if they volunteered, the so-called Sperrpakete, providing about 2,300 calories a day compared to the 1,200 for standard forced labourers. A workforce of mostly Dutch and Ukrainians worked 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. After 4 weeks of this, they were supposed to get 2 weeks off. It will surprise you not a lot to hear that they never got the 2 weeks off. They were engaged on precision engineering which, should the parts be even slightly off, would have catastrophic consequences for the whole aircraft, but they were bone tired, and by 1944 they were well aware of which way the war was going to go. Little wonder then, sabotage or mistake was a constant issue. Even without deliberate sabotage, what was being built was novel and complex with no safety margins built in whatsoever. One slight cock-up in the fuel lines or tank seals or material usage or any kind of shortcut or failure of inspection would cause the aircraft to become a flying bomb. In peacetime it would be hard enough, but in wartime, when you never knew whether or not the factory roof was going to disappear in a sheet of flame and death thanks to the USAAF, and with a workforce that was completely knackered being driven to unrealistic targets on pain of being shipped to concentration camps, it was a next to impossible task. To add complication here, having just jumped horses once, the RLM then also ordered from early 1944 that Junkers and Heinkel both pitch in to try and up the numbers. This did nothing to help manage the complexity or assure quality, and arguably just made everything much, much worse. Manufacturing faults reported by the IKEDO 16, who we'll talk about in a little bit, in their monthly reports to the RLM are endless. Radio equipment installed wrong or simply missing, tanks that didn't seal, fuel cut-off valves put in backwards, disconnected wiring, antenna that was bent, skids that wouldn't deploy, wheel doilies that cracked or wouldn't release or came loose too soon, oxygen equipment that cut out or simply hosed pilots with oxygen on the ground, guns that jammed for no apparent reason, bolts holding the wings on that were loose, and so on, and so on, and so on. Quality control at Clem and Messerschmitt, of course, should have picked up all of this, but it couldn't, or didn't at least, and it was never fixed. All of this meant that whilst the Me163BA0 was built in 1943 with a version of the Valter engine installed, it took a whole year to resolve the production version, the 163B1A, and the first units didn't start going into the hands of frontline pilots until 1944. Back in 1941, the plan had been to try and get all of these technical issues ironed out and the units into production in 1943 with a projection for 2,000 units by the end of the year. This, of course, kept getting pushed back and back and back. In fact, during the entire war, only something like 58 163As and 279 163B airframes were made, so it's fair to say that there was a tiny weeny gap between expectations and reality. Okay, so look, you've been very patient. Let's talk about the plane in a bit more detail. The bipropellant 509 engine took up more room than the much simpler R2. This meant squeezing fuel into every available nook and cranny that wasn't guns, including installing T-Stoff tanks around the pilot. Tanks that were prone to leaks because T-Stoff basically ate everything it touched sooner or later. Because of the lack of the pressure system, there was no accurate fuel gauge anywhere, so understanding how much fuel was left in the tanks came down to waiting for the engine to cut out, which it might do because the tanks were empty, or it might do because something else had failed. Either way, it meant that the 163 almost always landed with at least some fuel on board in at least one of the tanks, which was seriously bad news, as we'll discuss in a moment. Part of the supposed upgrades was a degree of armour plating behind the pilot's head, for example. Although one imagines that should a bullet travel down the length of the rocket engine, the armour behind the pilot's head would be as useful as a sock in a brothel. They also armoured the belly and the cockpits around, which, made some sense because this is where the fuel was stored, and well, bullets really shouldn't go in there. Well, the pilot was going to have an unbelievably bad, but probably very brief day. This armour does seem to have had some effect, and various USAF Fighter Command pilots reported hitting the plane with their 50 cals, but it having no visible effect. On the other hand, at least a dozen or so were shot down, mostly exploding in mid-air, so one does rather imagine that either the armour was defective or not fitted, or simply not strong enough to shrug off large-caliber freedom seeds. By the time a full load of fuel and armament was on board, this baby weighed over 4,300 kilograms, that's about 9,500 pounds, a hell of a lot for an airframe which is only a smidge over 18 feet long. For comparison, a Spitfire was about 30 feet long and a P-47 was almost twice the length. In fact, the 163 was almost exactly twice as wide as it was long, mostly lifting surfaces, but nonetheless takeoffs were a challenge. Not having any undercarriage didn't exactly help in this department. It relied instead on a sort of kind of hoverboard design with two skateboard wheels strapped to a doily, which the brave pilot would then release once airborne. Cock this up, as of course inevitably a number of pilots did, and the wheels would bounce straight back up into your highly fragile aircraft. This would then either rupture a fuel line or potentially even knock your tail up, causing you and the flying stick of TNT that you were riding to go nose down at several hundred miles an hour just a few feet off the deck, with reliably disastrous results. Furthermore, because this was a flying wing with a rocket engine that pushed, the control surfaces behaved quite differently from other aircraft that pilots may have flown. On a prop plane, air passes over the wings and the tails pretty quickly, even at low speeds due to the prop wash, but this of course isn't true in a jet or a rocket. The push is coming from behind, not a pull from in front, and there's no air flowing over the airframe at 0 knots. With the 163 being smaller and consequently having smaller control surfaces, you had to get up to quite a speed to actually take off, meaning that you might need up to 1,500 meters to get airborne. It's basically a mile on the ground attached to temporary wheels designed to fall off and being pushed by one of Valter's special little rockets, whose only real desire in this world was to kill you. And the 509 engine badly wanted to kill everyone and everything. The 163 would explode at the drop of a hat. They exploded in hangars, they exploded on the runway, they exploded when they were supposed to be full of fuel and when they were supposed to be empty. They exploded mid-flight, they exploded on landing. The problem was so bad that reading accounts of test pilots is essentially reading a list of who exploded when. In fact, the only time that it wouldn't necessarily explode was during takeoff, when instead the plane would fly into the air and suddenly the rocket motor would just stop. Because, I don't know, it was a day with a Y in it, or someone had been rude about the exhaust, at which point 2 tons of angry propellant would fall earthwards, only to vanish in a blinding flash and a puff of steam. Ground crews were instructed to flush the whole system with water as quickly as possible on landing, but just moving the aircraft around required trying to crane what amounted to a ticking time bomb and move it from wherever it had just landed to the water, meaning specially designed airbags, which honestly remind me more of implants than a serious bit of engineering, to inflate under the wings and then tow it along very, very carefully. It wasn't unusual for planes to take off, develop flights mid-leak, allowing superheated steam and T-Stoff vapour into the cockpit, blinding and partly dissolving the pilot, who would then either bail out or die on impact with the ground. Planes would be pottering along on their glide flays, and suddenly the rocket engine would re-fire unexpectedly when they were, say, on final approach, burying the pilot and the plane several metres into the scenery. For an example of just how dangerous these aircraft were, Mano Ziegler's Rocket Plane, which is worth a read, but it's a bit of an odd book. During his 12 months with EP-16, he saw at least 14 pilots that were killed in accidents and another dozen badly hurt in crashes, with 5 more being shot down in just 12 months. That said, if it didn't immediately explode or cut out, then at full chat with a full load of fuel and maximum pressure, the Valfa engine would run for about 4.5 minutes, during which it would chuck the flying stomach to potentially 50,000 feet, whereupon it could glide back down to base, giving it an operational range of about 80 kilometres or 50 miles. But as space was at a premium, it couldn't ever really actually get to 50,000 feet because the cockpit wasn't pressurised, in the same way that the rocket engine wasn't pressurised. And these had both been deleted during the design phase, so if the pilot wanted to keep breathing and not black out and die, they really needed to level out at about 30,000 feet. In fact, to cope with the potential to go way high, pilots were given a special diet which literally reduced the amount of gas that they produced, and went through extensive pressurisation simulations on the ground using a captured Soviet pressure chamber. But even with all this specialist training, the pilots really did need to level out at some point, which, makes sense. Except, if the pilot levelled off halfway up the climb and left the throttle open, the aircraft would be moving so fast that it would experience something called compression almost immediately. And the controls stopped working, which is not good. To avoid this compression problem, the pilot would actually need, obviously, to pull the throttle back a bit. Now again, this is all perfectly sensible, except if you did both, that is, if you levelled out and you throttled back, would cause negative acceleration, and this in turn caused the fuel to start to foam in the tanks, introducing bubbles into the fuel feed system, which in turn meant that the engine would go out. Now restarting it was theoretically possible. Experience said that with the engines off, you needed about 2 minutes to let it settle before you tried to restart it, but in combat you didn't have 2 minutes, so you might well be tempted to try it early. If you did, then there was an excellent chance that the T-Stoff and C-Stoff wouldn't mix properly because of the bubbles, and then the engine would suffer a hard start followed by mid-air disassembly of the airframe. With such a short range, the plan in early 1944 was to try and establish a chain of Me163B bases across the Reich where they could go up, hit the bombers and land like slightly crap human-piloted SAMs. But as ever with plans in the Third Reich, it didn't quite work out, not least because of British and American bombing. Instead, they were corralled, somewhat ironically, around the synthetic fuel plants which made the fuel for the 163 in the first place, and almost nowhere else. Putting aside our fun with chemistry books, it's probably worth just bearing in mind that the key objective of really any fighter is obviously to go up and shoot down the enemy. This somewhat mundane task was very much an afterthought on the 163. Why worry about guns when you have a cool rocket? Well, what's the point of a rocket fighter if it can't fight? Due to the high speeds involved during an intercept, this presented a significant issue for belt-fed machine guns. Originally, the 163B was armed with twin 20mm Mk15120 cannons. These were a known quantity, which the Luftwaffe used extensively, but they proved wholly inadequate given the closing speeds. The air brakes on the 163A were deleted on the 163B to save weight, which meant pilots either closed in on slow-moving bombers with the engine on, meaning they were about 300 miles an hour faster than their targets, or they had to try and shut the engine off and then attack on the glide. And so this meant that the 163B needed more punch, and it was rapidly upgunned to the Mk108 30mm. Theoretically, this should have worked fine, but did I mention this thing was a rocket? The Mk108s just couldn't cope with the massive acceleration, which meant that they constantly jammed. To try and counter this, a certain Dr. Langweiler, reputedly inventor of the Panzerfaust, developed a very Nazi fix. Taking inspiration from the highly effective Schlager music system which had been employed on Ju-88 night fighters against British bombers, Dr. Langweiler fitted 10 50mm recoilless rifles to the wing stubs of the Komet. Wile E. Coyote style, these were then connected to a series of light-sensitive cells which, when they detected a shadow, would fire them automatically upwards. I guess? Sure, there must have been a simpler fix, but this is what they went with. Now, if a 50mm cannon shell does make contact with your aircraft, you are in deep, deep shit. It's fair to say this was sound reasoning. Reputedly, these things gave a hit like an 88mm flak burst. And as the Komet pilots were discovering how hard it was to shed speed when lining up on a target, I guess shooting from below is a bit of an easier shot. But fuck me, lads, did you not consider what might happen if you, I don't know, hit a cloud's shadow, for example? So yeah, a lot of these discharged uselessly upwards into cloud banks, except of course this is Nazi Germany towards the end of the war, so basically every and all safety features had been removed and come to that most common sense. The idea was that there would be a slight time delay on the rifles fusing so that they didn't all go off at once, because if they did, it would basically tear the little aircraft apart, and you guessed it, of course, a number of Komets did simply disintegrate mid-air when approaching particularly vicious-looking cloud banks. As we discussed a minute ago, the wheels were designed to eject on takeoff, which helped a lot with aerodynamics on takeoff, but it's naturally presented something of an issue when landing, to wit you'd released your wheels already. Now, bearing in mind a statistic here, the landing speed of the Komet was 160 miles an hour, with no wheels. Oh no, instead they got a single ski, a ski which on the Me163A had no springs, and a seat that was initially also not sprung, and an engine, of course, which wanted to explode like one of Terry Pratchett's dragons. As you might imagine, this went incredibly badly a lot of the time. You couldn't, for example, land on tarmac, so you had to land on grass, and inevitably grass has undulations in it, even if it didn't have bomb craters there, and the ski would, if you even slightly fucked this up, bury itself in the ground, which would then flip you arse over tit, at which point the exciting and high-speed chemistry in the back of your aircraft was likely to happen unexpectedly and it would explode. Honestly, I think Lippisch might win Crappiest Designer of the Year award for that little brainwave alone. Moreover, the seat fitting ensured that even if the 163 didn't transform into a miniature sun and didn't flip up, the pilot's back took the full force of the landing, a problem serious enough to hospitalise multiple pilots. And of course, heavy impacts from novice pilots could easily rupture something in the Demon Core, spraying C-Stoff and T-Stoff around the place. I've sort of touched on this already, but it's probably worth just turning our attention to exactly how they were proposing to try and use the aircraft on the front lines. Due to the superb build quality of the Third Reich, which we've already discussed, the Komet was fitted with a compass which basically behaved as if it had been pulled from a Christmas cracker. It was unable to cope with the kinds of acceleration that the rocket plane generated, and if the pilot had been climbing, they had to try and level out to give the crazily spinning needle a chance to settle and thus get a bearing. As we've discussed, this was a non-trivial activity with attendant risks of explosion, not to mention a decent chance of being intercepted. This was definitely a problem, and it was compounded by the way that the ground controllers try to operate the aircraft. I mean, essentially, all of their protocols have been built to this point to deal with piston engine aircraft, not rocket engine aircraft. The Me163, with its pathetically short range and lack of onboard radar, had to be guided from the ground, appropriately enough, a bit like a sort of guided missile or a flying bomb, and vectored onto targets. But since the ground controllers were unfamiliar with exactly what the limitations and indeed the advantages of the Komet were, they were often calling on it either far too late or far too early, both of which used up the short range of the Komet on useless zoom climbs to intercept fuck all. After months of operations, the Me163B still had no kills. And part of the reason for the problem with making kills, aside from the fundamental issues with the weapons and the airframe, was the pilots themselves. From early 1944, the plan had been to try and churn out about 90 pilots a month. A potential recruit to what amounted to a kamikaze squadron would either enter the Luftwaffe for the first time or be pulled out of a unit. They would then do some basic induction training for a couple of weeks, then transfer to a gliding school where they would be taught how to do fast skid-down landings. They would then be given a series of 3-towed and 1 rocket or sharp start on the Me163A before towed starts on the 163B with water ballast on board, and then finally 3 sharp starts in a 163B, which they may or may not survive. After this frankly ridiculous short training period, during which they wouldn't have even tried to fire their guns, for example, they'd be declared operational and sent to the front line. Almost all were either killed long before they got close to trying to tangle with the bombers, or did the sensible thing and unvolunteered themselves, returning to either training for piston engine aircraft or being dispatched as ground troops to the relative safety of the Eastern Front. On the 13th of May 1944, holy of holies, the Me163B finally made its first operational interception of an enemy aircraft a mere 2 years after testing had started. But immediately, design decisions bit it in the arse. As we discussed before, the air brakes had been deleted at the same time as the undercarriage, so it couldn't slow down. This forced the pilot to try and weave to bleed off airspeed. Sadly for him, whilst rolling around the sky like a drunk trying to exit a pub, he subjected the engines to a negative G flameout. The unpowered engine then refused to restart, and the quarry, reportedly a reconnaissance Mosquito, simply flew off into the distance, apparently none the wiser. By the end of June 1944, the EPKO-16 group charged with developing the 163 had shifted their operating base first from Peenemünde, following the RAF attacks on the site, to Anklam, which was also then bombed by the RAF, to Bad Schweizhausen, which was bombed by the USAF on the 10th of June, then to Brieg, then to Brandis, then back to the badly bombed Bad Schweizhausen, then back to Brandis, finally to Unterfeld in Upper Silesia. Each time they moved, they had to leave a set of specialist vehicles and staff behind to try and catch up as best they could. The aircraft would then be disassembled, loaded onto trains, then unloaded from the trains, and then rebuilt at their new site. Or they could possibly try and tow them there, which caused a number of crashes. Each move cost weeks of delay, even if no aircraft or kit was destroyed, which of course it often was. Furthermore, attempts to try and rectify the doctrine on how to use the fleet that we went through a minute ago were hampered by each move, as often the ground control staff were composed of women who couldn't, under Nazi rules, actually be reposted outside of their home area, which meant you had to start from scratch, training a whole new set of staff. Consequently, development slowed to a crawl in the first half of 1944, just as operational fighter units were supposed to be being formed. And on top of that, a long tail of specialist logistics, most notably spares, would either get destroyed or have to be rerouted or would be sent to completely the wrong place. Spare parts were a constant issue, especially after March 1944 and the stepping up of both RAF and USAAF attacks on the Luftwaffe in preparation for D-Day. One JG-400, for example, the first operational unit formed in December 43, initially and confusingly known as 20 JG-1, didn't actually manage to become operational for almost 7 months. As other units began to come on stream and tried to start operating from other fields, these problems just got worse, with insufficient parts, fuel, pilots and airframes, and not enough concentration of force to actually do anything against Allied attack. From the start of July 1944, one JG-400 was based at Brandis, just outside of Leipzig, the thinking here being that any aircraft going after synthetic oil plants in the area could be intercepted. What they rapidly discovered from their initial encounters with both the USAF and RAF daylight raiders was that the 163 at full chat had lost a lot of its manoeuvrability, its turning circle being many times worse than a supertanker. In fact, it shouldn't be a total surprise given just how fast they were going and really how tiny the aircraft was. It was so bad that even a lumbering, fully laden B-17 could use its speed disparity and better turning circle to cause all manner of issues for 163 pilots attempting to line one up. Having lost 7 163s in combat, the squadron scored its first actual kill on the 24th of August 1944, probably the first kill that the 163 had ever made, quickly followed by 2 others, bringing their tally up to 7 losses for 3 kills over about 100 combat sorties. The operational logs are filled with "took off, engine flamed out," or "took off, forgot to shut down engine, lost control at 1,000 km an hour," or "took off, cabin filled with T-Stoff fumes, passed out." All in all, it was a bit of a bugger being a 163 pilot, even when they didn't randomly detonate on takeoff or landing. Roughly 1 in 5 of all takeoffs resulted in some kind of technical failure, many either lethal or resulting in injury. At best, this meant broken vertebrae from hard landings on the skids, and at worst it meant various body parts being digested or burnt. Faces, backs, hands, legs, groins all got splashed with T-Stoff and burnt as the liquid caught fire. If the fuel leaked onto a parachute, it would burn through it in moments, even if it had been treated with a protective PVC coating. And it's worth noting that parachutes were packed so to deploy slowly at high speeds to avoid being torn, but that meant if the pilot needed to bail out at low altitude, it simply didn't open. It's worth pointing out that throughout all of this, there was clearly a huge amount of pressure being put on the factories to churn out more fighters, but what there wasn't was pressure to build the supporting infrastructure. Trucks, hoses, valves, protective gear, all that kind of stuff sat at the bottom of a long list of things that the Nazis wanted to make a low priority. For example, 6 months was lost because the chemical works couldn't actually make Seestoff in any quantity due to other demands, providing only enough for Walther to try and continue work on his engines. Things got so bad that in late September 1944, the Führer headquarters issued an order prohibiting discussion of the 163's combat record, as it was, quote, only available in small numbers and still experimental. This despite the fact it had officially been made operational in August. And of course, frontline operating squadrons were suffering significant wear and tear. For example, one JG-400 reported just 6 out of 28 machines were actually operational at the start of October 44. Lack of spares and accidents were crippling operations, and the results were dreadful, resulting in far higher numbers of Luftwaffe casualties than Allied ones. By March 1945, World War II was almost over bar the shouting, with the Allies advanced well into Germany. The experiment on the 163 had failed. The last actual kill by a 163 was actually in early December 1944, with no kills at all achieved in November. As a result, the last unexploded 163s were abandoned or exploded deliberately in April. And so ended the career of the 163 rocket fighter. Once the fighting was over, the USAF found itself in possession of several thousand litres of some of the most unpleasant fuel imaginable. 80% hydrogen peroxide was simply not something that anyone in the US had ever had much use for, so the Army was pretty keen to see if it could use it. But after performing some basic safety tests, they realised that it was, in fact, chock full of impurities, meaning it was so bloody dangerous they daren't touch it. Allegedly, and I really don't know if this is true, but it was sold to a large US hair dye manufacturer who diluted it and used it to weaponize blonde hair rather than weaponizing rocket fighters. True or not, there was post-war testing with the 163 in both the US and the UK and indeed in the Soviet Union, but no one was really that keen to try and revive a project which was so obviously flawed. Do come in, do have a seat. Don't mind the plastic sheetings. Jenkins is just getting ready for a meeting with His Majesty's Customs and Revenues Office. I'm sure it's all a bit of a misunderstanding. We'll soon get it straightened out. At the end of this video, I suppose the moral of the story is that innovation is good, but it isn't an absolute good, and sometimes it can backfire on one fairly spectacularly, especially if you try and rush it. In the grand scheme of things, the Me163 ate a pretty substantial set of resources. Using a novel fuel, each start cost about 10,000 Reichsmarks. That's about $85,000 or £70,000 in today's money. For every 4 starts, the Reich could have made a brand new Bf-109, and of course that ignores entirely the 1 million Reichsmarks cost of training the pilot, the cost of the airframe, and of course the opportunity cost for the Third Reich. A bit like the V2 program, they were much simpler and more effective programs which, had Milch and Messerschmitt and Göring and all the other guys that were involved had any control over their organisations, they would have made a great deal more sense. And unlike the 163, they might have had some impact on the war. Maybe. I think personally that there's something in all of this about the sunk cost fallacy. That is to say that having gone so far down a particular road and having invested so much time and money in making the bloody thing work, it was incredibly hard for the people involved to say stop, even when the 163 was killing a lot of young men. It's true today that if you ask an organisation to stop doing something that it's been doing for a long period of time, this can prove to be very, very difficult, even if it's not working. And in something like Nazi Germany, where potentially feedback to the higher command could see you sent to a concentration camp or the Eastern Front, or potentially just back to your standard unit where you'd be shot down by Allied fighters, it wasn't exactly an environment which encouraged the sort of clear-eyed thinking that you needed. Part of the difficulty with saying stop in a sunk cost situation is that all you can ever know is how much you've wasted in terms of money and effort, not the outcome. And this, of course, is the difficulty. When exactly do you pull the plug, and how do you know what the alternatives might be? I think with the 163, when it started to kill pilots in the kind of quantities that it did, though, it must have been pretty bloody obvious that something was fundamentally wrong. At the end of it all, how do I feel about the 163? Well, it was a Nazi project built to defend one of the most evil regimes that's ever existed, so I'm not exactly inclined to shed many tears that it failed. I suppose the best that can be said was mostly harmless from an Allied point of view. And at the end of the day, it killed many more servants of the Third Reich than it did anyone else. So it was a colossal failure by any sensible measure for the Third Reich, and good job too. Had they pumped these same resources into, I don't know, maybe the Me262 or maybe just even more flak guns, they'd unquestionably been better used. But again, these were Nazis defending a genocidal state for a twisted idea of superiority over conquered and enslaved masses, so fuck 'em. And on that note, I think we should probably close things out. I hope you've enjoyed this video. There are many others on my channel you may also enjoy. Do feel free to do things like click the like button or leave a comment. Ideally a comment that's not being too rude about my parents. It's really not them to blame. If you really enjoyed this, then perhaps consider coming to sign up for my Patreon and help me fund the small library I'm developing and keep that roof watertight. But there is no compulsion. You are a wonderful person for just having got this far, and I hope to see you back here very soon.